We are going to be in a recession. It is inevitable. And the only thing that is not inevitable is how we deal with that situation. How we choose our next leader to guide the policies of a nation will determine how deep the recession is and how long it lasts. Will make all the difference on how we survive and get through the other side and survive getting to the other side. We will.
With Election Day looming, Canadians from coast to coast to coast are on tenterhooks. Every day, pundits and politicians are telling them that the upcoming vote will be the most consequential of their lifetime, that the fate of the country is in their hands. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. It should come as no surprise that Canadians are anxious. Anxious about Donald Trump's persistent threats to annex Canada and slap additional tariffs on Canadian imports. Anxious about the state of the Canadian economy. Anxious about their financial future. Anxious about paying the rent or the mortgage, keeping their jobs, and putting food on the table. They're looking for leadership and direction in a time of extreme political turbulence and uncertain economic waters. Armine Yalnizyan has spent her career explaining budgets, markets, and fiscal matters to generations of Canadians. She's an economist, Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, and a Toronto Star columnist. In 2023, she was awarded the Galbraith Prize in economics, named in honor of the esteemed Canadian economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Armine Yalnizyan, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thank you for having me.
The Conservatives released their election platform just 6 days before Election Day. The Liberals had released theirs earlier. What's your assessment of the two platforms?
The Liberals are very much focused on the earth-challenging policies of the Trump administration. And the other is really focused on, let's just get back to bon temps encore, let the bon temps rouler.
Let the good times roll.
Yeah, just really kind of ignore what's happening. It'll all come good, and let's just move ahead and away from the Liberals. So it's very much a message that is out of step with what is going on economically, globally, to be honest.
Okay, let's drill down then. Let's talk about the Liberals first. What are the highlights for you?
The highlights for the Liberals are very much that we need to disentangle our economy from the United States because it can no longer be trusted. And there is no economy on the surface of the planet that is as entangled with the United States system as Canada. So that will take a lot of doing. Their major plan is to continue spending, but lever a lot of private sector investment to rebuild east-west supply chains and energy grids. That's the main part of it. They will not cut back on social spending, but nor will they increase it tremendously. So it's kind of a not steady as she goes, because it's like, let's reconfigure the economy as she goes.
And what does that mean to fundamentally reorient Canada's economy?
Well, let's put it this way. Canada's been a trading nation since it was a British and French colony. Our number one trading partner in the world is the United States. 80% of our exports go to the United States. We import more from the United States than any other country. So 80% of what we make that are goods, we export to the United States. The second closest rival is China at 3.7%. of all of our exports. The third is the United Kingdom at 3.4%, and the fourth is all of Europe at 3.2%. So making up the difference for even a 10% decline in how much we trade with the United States will require us to double what we now do with all of the above. This is going to be an extremely difficult process of extraction, and the Canadian market being about 1/10 of the size of the American market, we produce more than we can consume. We need to ship out a lot of these products that we are busy making for the world.
So how do you even go about doing that? And do the Liberals give an indication as to their methodology?
They are basically looking at improving infrastructure, again, making us a little bit more energy independent, though our number one export to the United States is oil. It's one of our biggest imports from the United States because the country is so vast that it makes more sense to go north-south than east-west. until now. So that requires a very different view of how do we get the energy we need and how do we become more energy self-sufficient. There's also, as you probably know, a big housing problem. It's a housing crisis for many people. And now with the slowdown of the economy, a lot of people that have mortgages will be unable to refinance their mortgage or keep up with their monthly bills. And a lot of people who are in rented housing will lose their rented housing, and there's no place cheaper to go to. So the crisis is real and it is on our doorstep. They do have a plan to accelerate builds for housing beyond even what the Trudeau government did, which was the first real expansion of publicly funded housing since the 70s. And their third angle is to relook at where our supply chains are coming from at every step of the manufacturing process, particularly for auto, and seeing if we can just actually do more with what we've already got to supply our own needs in a supply chain that is highly interdependent with the United States and Mexico.
Mark Carney has indicated his intention, if he becomes prime minister, to on day one deal with these kind of interprovincial barriers, trade barriers. How quickly would he have to move in order to deal with, I guess, the shortfall that comes from the challenges posed by the U.S. market right now?
Oh, let's be absolutely clear. No amount of dropping of internal barriers will make up for the loss of income from trading less with the United States. The reason is that most of the internal trade that we do in this country is between provinces that have a very small or negligible manufacturing base and the two provinces that are very rich in a manufacturing base, Ontario and Quebec. That's where most of the trade happens. Where it is likely to go is, more wine being traded, more maybe energy being traded across interprovincial boundaries. So we're acting as if we drop the barriers, there's a net gain. It is taking place with a background of a net loss in international trade. And if enough businesses collapse because of their loss of business with the United States, there'll be a smaller manufacturing base for the rest of Canada to trade with. So it's a very difficult moment. And it is a moment that Carney himself is not going to move forward on by himself. This is something for the provinces to do and should have done a long time ago. And actually, since 2016, have been doing to some extent.
One of the criticisms of the Carney platform, the Liberal platform, is that they're spending too much. How do you respond to that?
They cannot do anything but spend as much as they are spending, because if they don't, the collapse of the private sector will be simply amplified by the scaling back of the public sector. We are going to be in a recession. It is inevitable. The question is simply how deep and how long it will last.
There's no way to avoid it?
There is no way of avoiding this particular recession based on all the indications globally about what is happening to shipping, container shipping, what is happening to purchasing orders of manufactured goods in Canada, what is happening to consumer sentiment, what is happening to business investment. This is going to be a very painful period that we are entering. And if the government chooses to also cut back to be able to do some bean counting and say, we balance the books, it will add unnecessary pain to the story. However, that doesn't mean that you cannot roll back some expenditures. We need the government to step up at this moment. This is precisely the type of moment that governments are for in an economy.
Don Drummond from Queen's University says he's disappointed with the Carney platform because he believes that it was an opportunity to cut corporate taxes.
Nice. Well, we've been cutting corporate taxes, and that's not going to make a difference to companies that have folded because of Trump's tariffs. At the end of 2024, we had a business bankruptcy rate that had reached the levels we saw a year after the global financial crisis in 2009. And we are nowhere through finished this wave of bankruptcy right now. And that means a permanent change to the ecosystem of how business gets conducted, with fewer small businesses and more large businesses that will gobble up other small businesses. So we are looking at a wave of corporate concentration we haven't seen maybe ever in our history. Tax cuts will not help the smaller corporations, and tax cuts won't make up for the loss of business with the United States for the bigger ones.
Let's switch to Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives. What are the highlights of the Conservative platform?
Well, the Conservative platform is very much interested in making you believe that they're on your side as a worker. This is the same party that actually introduced profoundly anti-worker legislation at the very end of the Harper era. And I was fascinated to see that in their platform, they basically did an about face on what they had done at the tail end of the Harper regime in 2015 and said they would never introduce anti-union bills or right to work legislation. It's one of those, don't think of the elephant moments where you start talking like that. But they are very hard on immigration. They don't want more people to come in. They want to restrict the number of newcomers to far below the rate of housing. They want housing to catch up to the number of people we are adding to the system. Just a note of caution that 91% of all growth in our labor market came from immigrants since the pandemic hit. The Canadian-born population is aging. And if we restrict the intake of newcomers too much, we will have labor shortages.
And yet the argument is that the current Canadian infrastructure cannot handle the number of immigrants who've come into the country in a very short period of time.
Indeed, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. The degree of intake of newcomers, particularly temporary residents, was a bit of a panic attack when the economy opened up after the pandemic. And companies that had barely hung on through the pandemic were facing price spikes for supplies, wage spikes for lack of people, and they were going to fold then. So no government wanted to be, on their watch. You saw a massive wave of business bankruptcies because people couldn't find enough people to do work. So they opened up the taps on the fastest way of opening up the taps. Immigration is a pretty slow process. They quickly opened up the taps on temporary foreign workers and international student permits, which are another form of low-wage, ready labor for the Ubers of the world and the DoorDashes of the world. Basically, very low-paid jobs that are gig work. And that turned out to be a disaster because we already had a housing problem. And then we had too many people. No way that the adding of people made things better, but they were not the cause of the housing crisis. They just simply piled on to a situation that was decades in the making.
What was the cause of the housing crisis?
Oh, well, we had enormous amounts of public investments in housing in the post-war period right up to the early 1970s. By the 1990s, the then liberals decided the government should get out of the business of housing. And it was only in 2017 that we got governments back into the business of housing. But the first leg of that wave of investment was simply repairing what they had built in the 60s and 70s. So we are looking at a very ambitious housing strategy now that every party has got on the menu because every party knows they have to deal with the housing crisis. Look, if you cannot keep a roof over your head, that is your number one problem, economically speaking, in this country. And that is what an awful lot of people are facing, particularly if unemployment numbers continue to tick up.
One of the selling points of the Conservative platform, according to the Conservatives, is that they're offering $75 billion in tax cuts. What do you make of that?
Everybody's offering tax cuts. Your mother-in-law, if she was running for politics, would be offering tax cuts. That's the way everybody has interpreted the affordability crisis is let me put more money in your pocket, which is the biggest folly I can imagine in the sense that we are moving into an era with population aging and more demands on public services from people who have got smaller incomes than they did when they were working age. It's going to be very hard to raise taxes. So cutting them is absolute folly because turning around and trying to boost revenue so you can provide more services that are absolutely legitimately needed is going to be extremely difficult to do. And yet that's the best they can come up with at this moment.
So you're saying, Armine, then that these tax cuts are expensive. They cost the economy.
Yeah, though it's interesting that the Conservative platform put the tax cuts in a column called revenues, which means they're going to be making money. How does that math work? Well, if we cut taxes, it will boost the economy. My friend, we have been going through this since the 1990s. This is literally like the 1990s called, they want their policies back. The 1990s was when we heard this magical math thinking in economics. If you cut taxes, your economy will grow faster. Some businesses will probably say, hallelujah, thanks for getting out of my way. But taxes are somewhere around the seventh or eighth consideration for economic growth. It's not that they're immaterial, but they really don't make that much difference. Now, when you cut taxes and give people more spending money, normally that's what's inflationary. So it's pretty rich to hear the party that is most against governments creating inflation by spending too much, giving people back their money so they go and spend more and create inflation through the consumer side.
And yet the Tories are saying that what they're trying to spur economic growth. They're trying to create a growth economy. They're trying to deal with the fact that we had this quote unquote, lost decade in which the Liberals thwarted a lot of investment in the Canadian economy.
Yeah, well, that's not what the numbers show. The numbers show that we have had more investment in the last few years in Canada and more foreign direct investment coming into Canada and more foreign direct investment coming out of Canada and being invested elsewhere than we have seen in a very long time. So it's very easy to say these things. And there's not one party out there that doesn't want growth. We are talking about decline in the immediate future. We are not talking about growth. We are talking about offsetting the potential not only for a short recession, but a long recession, not one that lasts for 2 quarters, which we won't find out if we're in or not till after the summer's over. But you can see from every other metric that we are in a period of scaling back and doing less.
This is all a result of Donald Trump's tariffs?
100%. Both the United States and Canada were doing extremely well by the end of 2024. The outlooks were looking pretty solid. Around the world, economies are slowing because around the world, wherever there was a baby boom, those people are aging out of the labor market. What does that mean? It means that they are now living on retirement incomes, which is less than they had when they were working. It also means that they buy less, they spend less. And so there's a natural drag on household spending, and household spending in every country, anywhere in the world, is the major driver of an economy. In Canada, it's 57% because we trade so much. In the United States, it's 70% of the economy is driven by the consumer. So when, a chunk of your consumers, roughly a quarter of your consumers are now seniors, you're going to have less spending. So, basically economies are slowing because of demographics in the richest countries in the world. But you add on to that sloth, basically policies that constrain and choke off even more growth. And because we're growing so slowly, less than 2%, it doesn't take much to nudge you towards recession. And then when you get the type of crazy volatility in public policy that we have seen in the United States, it puts a chill on everybody. Everybody is just rushing to stand still and watch what happens next. Nobody's doing anything more than they have to do. And that guarantees a contraction of economies everywhere.
A lot of young people are lamenting the fact that unlike their parents' generation, they are unable to purchase homes. They just can't afford it. They've been priced out of the market. The Conservatives have a policy. They're proposing the elimination of the GST on new homes costing less than $1.3 million. Will that be a boon to housing in this country?
It'll be a boon to the people that have enough to have a down payment. They'll save a bit of money on, 13% is not immaterial for people that are buying a house, but it's not enough to make the difference between those who could have and couldn't. The problem young people are having is they are spending so much money on rent that they are having a tough time saving money to put together the down payment. And unless they've got the bank of mom and dad to rely on, it's very difficult to get into the housing market.
The Conservatives are also promising a Taxpayer Protection Act that would basically ban hiking taxes or introducing new ones unless a referendum allows it. What do you make of that?
It's a version of we can't spend more, don't look at us, we're not here to spend more, we're here to cut your taxes. It's a small government philosophy that it has been the calling card of Conservatives since the 1980s.
It sounds like you're calling it a gimmick.
100% it's a gimmick. If you can't raise taxes and what your people need is more services because they are aging and because everybody in a household is working, so who's taking care of the kids? Unless you're expecting more women to drop out and do unpaid care, 50% of employees are women. They make up a smaller share of the self-employed, but we've got 21 million people working and 18 million of them are employees, and half of those people are women. So if you're assuming that women are going to do the unpaid care of the people that are too old, too young, and too sick to take care of themselves, this is another way you are going to hobble whatever slender chances you have for growth in the economy. And if that is only being done because you refuse to raise money to be able to provide the services people need in terms of paid care, you're shooting yourself in the foot for the purpose of a slogan saying that you're going to put money back into people's pockets. Putting more money in my pocket does not help me find the services I need.
What about the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc Québécois? What can you tell us about their platforms?
I have to say I have not spent as much time on the Bloc Québécois platform because it is not a national platform. I have spent less time on the federal Green platform than I should have, but I was quite impressed by the provincial Ontario Green platform, and there are some similarities. I would summarize the NDP as being absolutely, like, they are the party of labor. They always have been the party of labor. And it's fascinating that their approach to the conundrum we find ourselves in is to not expand goods production, which makes up about 25% of GDP and 20% of all jobs. It's to try and protect what we've already got, but really focus on the inadequacy of public services. Now, I'm partial to that approach, but that isn't the way you're going to pay for the future. So you do need some kind of industrial strategy that is very strong in not just protecting and preserving what we've got, but actually growing what we've got and disentangling ourselves from the United States, given we've got another 3.5 years of this, and it's not going to get nicer.
Some people have suggested that Canada's problems predate Trump. And one of the core problems that this country faces is a productivity crisis. Do you concur with that?
My entire life as a professional economist has been involved with the productivity conversation. Since the 1980s, we have talked about Canadian productivity failing in the test against the United States.
And what does that mean? What does productivity actually mean?
You know, it's a great question. It is a great question because it's unclear what different people mean. You know, the average person listening to your show, if they know what the term means, they probably equate it with work harder, work faster. From an economic formula, it means that you're either getting the same GDP for less costs in inputs, or you're getting more GDP for the same costs in inputs. But here's the kicker about productivity. Since the 1990s, we've been digitizing our economies, and we don't measure data in productivity formulas. Are we being more efficient or less efficient because of the digitization of our work? Again, 80% of our economy is in services, and a huge part of that is touched by digital services. Even people working in manufacturing or mining work with computer technology that is digitized. So digital technology is everywhere, and yet we don't count that as part of the technological processes that might make us more efficient. All we count is inputs and outputs. How much did we spend on inputs? How much do we get for outputs? That's basically the measure of productivity. But here's another problem with the productivity measure. Productivity improvements are absolutely critical for boosting the economy beyond what it would be based on what we're doing today. However, they tell you nothing about how the fruits of that productivity are distributed. Nothing. Zero.
So is productivity about working smarter? Is that it? It's kind of figuring out ways to do more with less. Okay.
So when you take a look at the manufacturing story in the United States, and everybody's losing their marbles about reshoring some of these manufacturing jobs, manufacturing production might come back to the United States if the president would just stop changing his mind about what policy is for more than 5 minutes so that people can decide what they're going to invest in. But once all of that is over and let's say manufacturing gets reshored, production might be reshored, but not necessarily the jobs. The new plants that are being invested in are highly robotic. So yeah, you're more productive, but are workers getting a piece of that action? And that's the same thing with GDP per capita. People rave about how terrific GDP per capita is in the United States. They've got much higher rates of poverty. GDP per capita is an average. It is the amount of GDP in a country divided by the population of the country. And it tells you nothing about the distribution of GDP per capita. And one of the reasons why GDP per capita is so enormous in the United States compared with every other country, not just Canada, is because of the digitization of services. If you will recall, on the day of his inauguration, President Trump had behind him 4 of the 5 richest men on the surface of the planet, and they all made their money from digital services. There are ways of making tremendous amounts of money, monetizing your data and mine, that we give them for free for the convenience of using their platforms, and they figure out how to make money out of it. That is productivity in a nutshell. Make something out of nothing. And if you own it, how is that better for everybody else? The ownership of the fruits of productivity is at least as important as the quest for more productivity.
So what's the significance then of this term, GDP per capita? The economist Trevor Tombe at the University of Calgary has suggested that the gap between the Canadian and American economies is widening and that Canadians' purchasing power is declining and that GDP per capita is a measure that we really need to take seriously.
GDP per capita has been a concern for Canadians, and they pointed to it in much the same way they pointed to our productivity failures compared to the United States as they see it, which has been largely related to investments in oil sands actually falling off because the world is divesting from fossil fuels. That's one of the reasons why our productivity fell. Similarly, our GDP per capita is falling in comparison to the United States, as is virtually every other country. And that is because of the digital revolution in the United States, where a handful of companies have made huge returns on monetizing our free data, the data we give them when we use their platforms. And they figure out ways of selling things back to us. No other country does that. These big globe-straddling digital companies are headquartered in the United States. That's where the gains get counted. But those gains are not distributed. So when Trevor or any other economist says our purchasing power is falling, on average it might be, but purchasing power is not distributed on average amongst all households. And our lowest income workers are, relatively speaking, better off than in the United States for no other reason, because they have access to publicly funded healthcare, which is at risk at the moment, but is still superior to what the Americans get in the United States.
So I'm trying to understand, are you saying then that we should disregard this measure or we shouldn't take it as seriously as Trevor Tombe is?
I certainly don't take it as seriously as Trevor Tombe does. And I think it is like a little sister to the productivity story, which is challenging on two fronts. On the first front is, how do we measure productivity? And on the second front, who gets the benefits from productivity gains? Many of the investments that companies are making in the 21st century are not in machinery and equipment as much as in digital products. Now, there is some machinery and equipment involved in that, but it isn't the big clunky goods production machinery and equipment that used to drive our productivity. We are already in transition to a much more digital economy, and we really don't measure it well on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's unclear that we aren't already a 51st economic state, in the sense that all of our productivity was tied in the earlier period that people long for in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to the fact that we were becoming the 51st economic state by becoming a branch plant of the United States resource extraction and manufacturing sector machinery. So watch what you wish for you may get it.
You recently wrote that inflation and interest rates may be down, but prices are up in this country, that there's a cost of living crisis in Canada. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, inflation is the pace at which prices go up, whereas prices have gone up and they're not coming back down. So there's the distinction between a rate of price change and a level of prices. And these levels of prices, for example, the fastest growth in any element of any household's budget has been housing. Mortgage interest costs are now up 58% above where they were at before the pandemic hit. Rent costs are about 30%. So are groceries. So a lot of people's wages have not met that increase. And so they are falling behind on absolutely the basics. Now, there's very little that governments can do on groceries, but there's lots they can do on housing, and there's lots they can do on things like energy independence and actually reducing people's costs for heating, at least, by having more energy efficient retrofits and also by having better public transit systems. But it does take an all-of-government approach. And, you have to be aware that not everybody lives in a big city. Most people live in a big city. And these policies that I just mentioned are much more doable where you've got high density. But you do have huge swaths of the country that need to be dealt with also in ways that is appropriate for their regional realities. And it's very difficult to do, and you can't do it without more government.
What does that mean, more government?
You just need public spending. You need public policies to actually decide what are the priorities, how you're trying to get the market to adapt to these new realities. If it is higher energy costs and higher housing costs, how are you addressing those two things to lower the costs of energy and housing? That takes public policy. It isn't just a matter of supply and demand. If you're doing nothing to change the dynamic of supply and demand, those pressures will remain. But there are things that governments can do to reduce the pressure of rising demand or falling supply. And both of these things are happening.
The picture you're painting, at least to me, seems rather bleak. It seems as if you're suggesting that the Canadian economy is in a very fragile state.
I have no other words for it than recessions are inevitable. And the only thing that is not inevitable is how we deal with that situation. Who we select to guide us through this next period will determine how deep the recession is and how long it lasts. And that's where the variability comes in. So yeah, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for the people that have the least financial cushion to deal with things, as it always is. A lot of people won't feel a thing. A lot of people didn't feel a thing during the global financial crisis or the dot-com bubble or the 1987 meltdown in stock markets. Some people won't feel a thing because they have enough. But this is going to grab an awful lot of people's attention, and how we choose our next leader to guide the policies of a nation, not just a province or a region, will make all the difference on how we survive and get through the other side and survive getting to the other side. We will.
Armine Yalnizyan, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your show.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.